Thank you for tuning into this session, Finding Your Role, SANEs and Violence Prevention.
Before we get started, we wanted to take a quick moment to introduce ourselves as the folks speaking throughout this recording. My name is Nicole Cunningham, and I am the Abuse Prevention Coordinator at the Oregon Attorney General Sexual Assault Task Force. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And a fun fact about me, I have a dog that I love and really enjoy spending time in Portland, getting to try new food and drinks.
And I'm Meg Foster. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am the Prevention Program Coordinator at the Oregon Sexual Assault Task Force. And I grew up in Northeastern Oregon in the Blue Mountains, about 10 miles outside of a town of 636 people. And so I have a very fond place in my heart for Oregon's rural communities. And I'm always trying to get back there.
All right, before we get started here, let's share a few objectives, things that we hope folks will take away from this recording. We are hoping that participants will be able to explain at least 3 different health promotion and violence prevention principles and how they can be applied to SANE work. Participants will be able to describe at least 2 different ways that prevention is foundational to SANE work. And participants will be able to identify at least 1 thing that they can do to prevent violence and abuse.
So jumping right in, I think it's really important to name that violence and abuse are preventable and everyone has a role and a responsibility in preventing it. And I think oftentimes, especially when we deal with response work, like medical forensic work, SANE work, it's really easy to kind of forget this piece that violence and abuse are preventable because we're hearing stories of trauma on a regular basis. And so I just want to give a friendly reminder that this is not an inevitability. Sexual violence, other forms of violence and abuse are absolutely preventable. And it's all about finding our role in it. That being said, our role might change over time. It might change minute to minute, right? Sometimes we might be an on-call SANE, and our role in that moment might look a little bit different than maybe when we're at home and being a friend or a parent or a partner or a colleague or a coworker in the office. And so really finding our role can feel really challenging. But that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today, and recognize that not all our roles are going to be the same, and they're probably going to be changing over time. We do know that because we get a lot of emails and requests from SANEs across the state of Oregon to think about their roles in prevention. We know that SANEs and other responders to sexual violence in particular often come to prevention because they're burnt out on hearing those stories of violence and abuse on a regular basis. This often leads folks to places of, how do we stop this? And so that's what we're hoping we can navigate with you all today, and hope you can find some pieces that you can take away and think about how you're going to apply this to your own work.
Absolutely. And so building on that, one thing that we know is that in all of our different roles, we're going to have the ability to have different impacts on the people that we come into contact with and serve. We also know that every time someone interacts with us in our systems, our policies, and et cetera, they'll walk away from that a little different than they were before. We get to come into our work every day doing the best we can to make that a positive experience and to ensure that folks will continue accessing services and seeking out whatever it is that they need to be healthy and safe. So what does this mean for what we get to do in our work? Well, everyone deserves to be safe and healthy, and we get to be proponents of this. We get to create and contribute to systems that promote health and wellness for all people. And you, as SANEs, are directly contributing to the success and safety of all of our communities.
So what do we mean by prevention? Oftentimes, people confuse prevention with other activities, such as risk reduction. Risk reduction most commonly attempts to teach individuals ways to reduce their likelihood of victimization. An example might be campaigns to encourage people to not leave their drink unattended, or to not go anywhere alone, or to not wear their hair in ponytails, or whatever, the list goes on and on. One of the benefits of risk reduction is that it often helps people feel like they have some control over their safety, which is huge. Empowering people and giving that sense of control back to people can be so meaningful. The problem with risk reduction is that it doesn't actually work to stop the violence before it happens, though. And it focuses most commonly on those experiencing violence, not on those perpetrating it. So I know that as a woman, I could follow all the rules. I could never leave my house. I could wear a padlocked jumpsuit. I could never talk to anyone. I could never drink alcohol. And that doesn't eliminate my risk of experiencing sexual assault. What eliminates my risk of experiencing sexual assault is if somebody doesn't sexually assault me. So risk reduction has a lot of limitations. Public awareness is also often confused with prevention. Public awareness efforts work to raise awareness of the problem of sexual violence or other forms of violence and abuse. Public awareness often gives information about available resources. Some examples may include ribbon or poster campaigns. Public awareness activities have benefits, including that we need people to know that there's a problem before we can begin preventing it. These efforts are also a way to help folks know where to go when they have experienced violence, what resources are available, resources like SANEs. Public awareness often doesn't provide a solution, though. Those postering campaigns don't give us a lot of opportunity to work towards changing this norms and structures that support violence in the first place. So what do we mean by prevention? Primary prevention focuses on changing norms, rules, factors, and conditions that allow domestic and sexual violence and other forms of violence and abuse to occur in the first place. An example might be a multi-session, long-term program teaching folks about anti-oppression, healthy relationships and sexuality, working to address the root causes of violence. Prevention actively works to change the norms that allow for violence to occur in the first place. That being said, one of the limitations of primary prevention is that it can take a lot of time, and people often struggle with capacity to implement those really lengthy prevention activities. That being said, hopefully one of the things we get to talk about in just a moment is some of the ways that prevention can apply to your SANE work, as well as thinking about how your work and other work in your communities can get closer to that primary prevention efforts. An additional way that we like to think about this is what we call the working upstream example. This metaphor comes to us from traditional tribal nations stories and has been co-opted by public health in particular. And it's a really useful story, but one of the problems with co-opting things and not citing our sources is that we don't necessarily know the original origins of this story. So I would love to point you to specific tribes and communities, but I'm not sure. So we use this story to help us conceptualize what we mean by prevention, and in particular primary prevention. So I want you just to take a moment and I want you to imagine that it is a beautiful day. You're able to have a picnic. There's no pandemic going on. You can be with whomever you want. You're sitting on the banks of a river. It's gorgeous, the perfect temperature, whatever that is for you. Maybe there are birds chirping or squirrels playing nearby, whatever your perfect picnic vision is. So let's imagine it's an amazing day. You're with your friends, your family, your coworkers, your colleagues, whomever it is you want to be having a picnic with. And all of a sudden, you hear some screaming. You, your friends, your colleagues, your coworkers, whomever you're with, you run to the banks of the river and you see that there's someone in the river and they're drowning. You jump in the river and you fight the current and you grab this person and you pull them to safety and you're catching your breath. You're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that just happened. And then all of a sudden you hear more screaming. And so you jump back in the river and you pull another person out, and then there's more screaming, and then you pull that person out. And this goes on and on all day, where you are pulling people out of the river. After hours of pulling people out of the river, one of your friends, your family members, your colleagues decides to walk away. And you say, where are you going? There are people literally drowning in this river. and they say, I'm going upstream to figure out why people keep ending up in the river in the first place. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about primary prevention. How can we stop people from ending up in the river in the first place? So let's imagine for a moment that it was actually you that went upstream. And what you found when you got there was a series of bridges in various states of disrepair. It's really easy to see that the bridges in greater states of disrepair are the ones where more people are falling in the river. And so if we focus our attention there in making those bridges safer for people, we know that more people are going to make it safely across the river. It's not enough to just direct people maybe to safer bridges, because we have to think about who has access to which bridges, who even knows that safer bridges are available, what is the cost, the time it takes, the actual financial cost, et cetera, of accessing safer bridges. And so we need to look at those places where the bridges are crumbling and really work to bolster those. Those are things like addressing our root causes of violence, which I know Nicole is going to talk about in just a moment. But when we're talking about prevention, primary prevention is looking at addressing those root causes, but that doesn't mean that when we are midstream or downstream, we can't also hold those root causes in mind as well.
Thank you so much, Meg. Absolutely. That metaphor is, it's a perfect example, a really good way to think about how we can make sure that we're focusing our efforts on the places that we want them to be. And so one thing I want to come back to is here, you've heard us talk about the root causes of violence and abuse and about addressing the root causes. And so we want to spend a little time thinking about what that means. For us, that means thinking about oppression, first and foremost. Oppression is going to be defined here as the socially sanctioned abuse of power over others. We know that oppression can manifest in a number of ways. These are things like racism, sexism, ableism, heterosexism, religionism, classism, and so many more. These are those isms that you hear and that we talk about. The second thing that we want to talk about here is this idea of norms, which is defined here as formal and informal rules of behavior through which oppression is communicated and maintained. We know that norms are powerful catalysts in how violence and abuse show up in our world. These are types of things that we learn through our upbringing, through education, media consumption, and more that guide the way that we walk through and interact with the world. When we allow things like stereotypes, biases, prejudice, and other judgments that allow us to value some people over others to become norms, we're giving those ideas power. And ultimately, we are laying the foundation for violence toward people in those groups of others.
So addressing the root causes is a key prevention principle that applies to all of our work, right? We might be doing intervention or response work, SANE work, advocacy work, whatever that looks like. But addressing the root causes is a core prevention principle that we can all take on. Prevention means, again, that we are addressing those root causes of violence and abuse. Using that anti-oppression framework in the prevention world means that we're thinking about inclusiveness, accessibility, equity, and social justice in all that we do. How we communicate, how we model our work, how we support survivors, how we talk about healthy relationships, how we talk about unhealthy relationships. Using these lenses, incorporating an anti-oppression approach to all of our work is a key place that everyone can participate in prevention.
Absolutely. So let's think a little more about what this means then for your work as SANEs. And we think that this comes down to working with people rather than working on people. And so one thing that I want to kind of communicate here is that it can be really easy for us in the helping professions to fall into traps around what we think is best for someone based on our training, our knowledge, and our past experiences. While these are often really useful places to draw from, we also have to be willing to think critically about how we are showing up and doing the work, not just about the work itself. So what does this mean for you in your SANE work, both on a large scale and when working with individuals? Some ways to operationalize this concept of critical examination include the following that you're going to see on the left here. So be cognizant of your processes and products. How are we centering the experiences of those that we serve? And how are we limiting input or overlooking lived experiences? Acknowledge and shift power. This is providing space for questions and thoughtful, transparent feedback. Seek input and actually use that input when it comes to case management and decision-making on behalf of clients. Examine your attitudes and actions. How are we showing up intentionally or not when we are doing the work? How are we having bias show up in the way that we understand and in turn serve our clients? And be an active listener. Seek out diverse voices and learn from those who have historically been underrepresented in Western medicine. Acknowledge places that we've caused harm and seek to learn new methods to not repeat that harm. And then finally, thinking about how do we identify isms? This means looking at how our systems and individual interactions are upholding oppression. This could be things like language availability of resources, options for things like gender and sexuality on medical forms. How are we considering youth voices and consent when it comes to decision-making and involving parents or caregivers? And these are just some ideas of what this could mean, but that's a good place to start here. One thing that we like to say when we're really oversimplifying the idea of prevention is that effective prevention requires addressing the root causes of violence and promoting what is healthy. We know that it's not enough to tell people what not to do. We have to replace those things with healthier options and alternatives so that we can imagine new ways of doing what's been done and avoid causing and reinforcing harm.
So in this vein of oversimplifying prevention, those pieces around addressing the root causes are one place where we can all plug in prevention, how we can all apply that to our work. That being said, SANEs and advocates and other folks who are responding to incidents of violence and abuse also have a lot of opportunity to do that health promotion piece. And part of that is thinking about what does it actually mean to promote what is healthy? And we also have to think about what we mean by what is healthy. And so I like to start with thinking about like, what is healthy sexuality and health promotion? One of the tools that I really like to explore what we mean by healthy sexuality is something called the sexuality from Unhushed, and it's pronounced metrosexual. They offer us a concept of thinking about sexuality as something that affects us on an intimate level. So you and the people you're romantic or sexual with, these are the leaves of our tree, which are often, growing, changing, morphing, shifting over time. On a relational level. So our families, our friends, everyone else we know personally, this is the trunk of our tree. Again, shifts over time, but is sometimes harder to change. And then culturally, so this is like everyone in our communities, our cities, our states, our countries, the broader society that we exist within. And these roots are much harder to change over time, but not impossible. They offer us the idea that sexuality is something that we experience personally, as in we take it personally, we learn about it personally, we understand it in a very personal level. Individually, different people take it personally differently and uniquely. Indeed, no two people experience sexuality the same. So they offer us this tree, and then they offer us, I believe, 44 different items. And they ask us to place them on these different levels in the tree based on how we experience and understand those pieces for ourselves. Things like, desire, things like, monogamy, things like religion, things like age, things like abortion and sexual violence all show up in that list of things, and they inform our understanding of healthy sexuality. So they ask us to take some time and think about where we would put those pieces. And full disclosure, almost every time I've ever filled out the tree, I've put pretty much everything at every level because I experience those and understand those very differently at every single level. And I know that even if That's how I do it. If that's how all of you were to fill out your tree as well, the reasoning why we put things in different places is going to be different. And so taking a moment to understand that we all understand what is healthy for us and what healthy sexuality looks like for us in very different ways. And that'll help us make sure that those pieces around addressing the root causes, the pieces around inclusiveness and equity and thoughtfulness and how we do our work can really help guide us towards prevention.
Absolutely. So let's take a moment here and think about what does that mean then for what the role is of SANEs in prevention work? Well, prevention begins, as with SANE work, with creating safe spaces for people to tell their stories. So the best place that we think to start is by creating an environment that invites folks to show up as the most authentic version of themselves, which is something that you all as SANEs do on a regular basis. SANEs have a really powerful ability to impact folks when they are vulnerable. To be heard, seen, and feel valued are critical components of being able to tell their whole story and receive the fullest level of support possible. Another piece here to think about is providing inclusive, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed safes. Providing these in an inclusive, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed way is important for two reasons. One, this is going to help determine whether or not someone will access services and actually have their needs met. And on top of that, it's helpful when it comes to building trust and relationships with communities that have historically been hurt by medicine. When we view each opportunity, as a chance to serve in a way that is healing and safe, we can create a culture and climate where others feel empowered to access services currently and in the future based on mutual trust and respect. And finally, promoting healthy sexuality in your existing SANE work and in partnerships with others like schools. SANEs have a really cool lens that allows you to see the overlap between the medical field and violence and abuse response and prevention. This overlap is a critical piece of the puzzle that connects us all and helps us find our role. Promoting healthy sexuality is another component of that puzzle that highlights that overlap. We know that access to accurate and comprehensive sexuality education helps to prevent harm and also empower individuals to make healthy decisions for themselves.
So again, diving deeper into what is your role in prevention, starting to think about this health promotion piece, how can you as a SANE or whatever role you're in, model healthy boundaries, healthy relationships, and healthy communication, not just in your work, but in your lives? And how can you work to undo harmful norms and stereotypes that are showing up in your work?
Next piece here, we're going to go through some different prevention principles. So we're going to be talking about promoting healthy norms, open, honest, and authentic communication with our prevention, and positive framing.
So thinking about those pieces, we want to dive a little bit deeper into these prevention principles to give us a little bit of a how-to. So let's start with that first prevention principle, promoting healthy norms. What does this mean? It can mean so many things. Access to comprehensive and medically accurate, age-appropriate information for all. You all are uniquely positioned to be able to answer questions in a medically accurate way, right? Making sure that people have access to accurate information is a huge piece of this. And that age-appropriate piece, I know that sometimes we get a little uncomfortable sometimes thinking about healthy sexuality in particular with certain ages. That being said, a really interesting measurement for what is age appropriate is what questions are people asking us. So if you are serving a client or a survivor who's 5 years old, if they're asking questions about their bodies, about their experiences, how do we provide accurate, medically accurate and comprehensive information to those folks? So that's a key piece of this. Oregon is one of, I believe, 13-ish states in the country that actually requires sex ed to be medically accurate. And so how can we build on that infrastructure that we have here in Oregon to ensure that young people have accurate information, old people have accurate information, everyone in between, whatever we qualify as young or old, have access to accurate and comprehensive information. So often I see folks coming in and accessing services, and we talk so much about what sexual assault is, what violence is, what unhealthy relationships are, and we miss that opportunity to provide the contradictory piece of that, right? Like, what is a healthy relationship look like? What is, healthy sexuality? What is not sexual assault, but what is healthy sex? So we miss that opportunity to provide that information. Similar to that, information on health and gender equity. So again, going back to those core pieces of addressing root causes, how are we providing information that is inclusive and not restrictive, right? There are so many different types of bodies out there. They function in so many different ways. I was recently reading an article that said that, there are as many redheaded people in the world as there are intersex people. And so that's a lot of people. By limiting our services to only talk about men and women, we are missing a huge spectrum of people that exist who have different bodies that function in different ways. And so how can we make sure that our information is inclusive? It is inclusive of varying genders, and it is inclusive of how different folks may experience health. Focusing on consent is pleasure focused and not fear driven. The P word, pleasure, often makes people deeply uncomfortable, but it's such an opportunity. So often we talk about consent as only something to not perpetrate sexual assault, when in fact, consent is not about just not breaking the law or not harming someone. Consent is the crux of healthy sexuality. It helps us pursue pleasure, navigate pleasure, understand our bodies, explore our bodies, explore what we may or may not like. There's so much more to it. And when we only focus on the what not to do piece, we miss that opportunity to really dive into, well, how can we be healthy? How can we have healthy, fulfilling lives, even if we have experienced violence? Additionally, language to talk about relationships and sex is both normal and pleasurable. Similarly, when folks are working in the response sector, so often we hear people focus on the negative parts of relationships and sex, and we miss that opportunity to model for folks skills to talk about relationships and sex as normal, as things that can be pleasurable. We miss that skill building piece that can really help survivors move forward out of trauma. And then recognize that not everyone experiences and expresses sexuality in the same way. Just like we talked about with the sexuality, we're offered an opportunity to really think about how we understand and experience sexuality in very different ways. So often I have had responders come up to me after doing sessions on healthy sexuality, and they voice concerns about survivors who are interested in things like BDSM or other things that they've maybe deemed not healthy, when really what we know about BDSM communities is that they practice consent way more effectively than many communities, in fact, most communities. And so how can we maybe put aside some of those judgments to really help people explore what healthy sexuality and health looks like for them? So often, again, we focus on that what not to do, and there's so many opportunities, even if we're doing, awareness campaigns or other things, to infuse health promotion into those spaces. This is a campaign that was used at the University of Oregon, where to reframe consent. And it says, let's slow down. That's what he said. And I'm glad I listened because knowing what he wanted made it that much better. And I really love this specific poster in particular because it kind of flips gender roles on their head a little bit there, but it also offers a key example of how we can communicate about sex and sexuality. Granted, it's very limited. That being said, the tone of this changes entirely if all you see is that bottom part that says consent is not only sexy, it's the law. That doesn't give us any opportunity to think about how we communicate about consent, how we respect consent, and all of those pieces. So how we're messaging, how we're talking about sex and sexuality is so important. Similar, I really love Bradley Engel many years ago offered healthy relationships classes. So often what we see is people offering, trauma healing classes and other things, which are really important. But if we're not also offering that health promotion opportunity for folks, if we're not connecting people to opportunities to explore their health in really meaningful ways, we're really missing that chance to implement prevention even after violence and abuse has occurred. Additionally, I really like this last piece from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. Again, a very short social media image that is modeling what consent might look like. So how do we infuse those health promotion pieces into what we do? And why do we do it?
Absolutely. So that's the next question here. Thinking about those behaviors that we want to promote, why should we talk about these things? Well, promoting healthy norms decreases the likelihood of victim blaming. It reminds us that tone and our level of comfort matters. It doesn't sensationalize or rewrite other people's narratives. This allows us to name things and have good conversations with people. And this helps us to notice and celebrate changes. When we're thinking about promoting healthy norms, we are thinking as well about positive reframing. Where can we talk about and incorporate these healthy norms into your work? How can we work to reframe and shift our attitudes to see the positives where there are often many negatives in the way that we talk about this experience of sexuality, like Meg was talking about?
One way that I really like to start to cultivate some of those skills is building in opportunities to practice. And I say this consensually. Don't just force people to have conversations with you about sex, sexuality, healthy sexuality, right? We understand consent in our practice as well. And so this brings us to that second prevention principle. How are we fostering open, honest, and authentic conversations, right? And how do we practice those? One of the ways that I love to do this is often ask people in trainings, why do people have sex? And I ask people to talk to each other about this because one, then they're practicing talking about sex and sexuality, which can oftentimes be really uncomfortable for people. And it helps us dive a little bit deeper into why do we talk about sex and sexuality in certain ways? I have asked this question, why do people have sex, in countless trainings? And the number 1 or 2 answer is almost always because it's fun or it's pleasurable. To which I say, I hope so. And I think it's fascinating that every single time it's fun or it's pleasurable is one of the top answers, yet that is consistently one of the things we don't talk about when it comes to sex and sexuality. I've gotten a huge array of answers from everything from it's fun, it's where babies come from, which I often respond, it's a place that babies come from. Folks often say, sometimes people don't have a choice. Sometimes people are bored. Sometimes for an exchange of goods. There are so many reasons why people have sex. And if we're not having those open, honest, and authentic conversations about it, we're missing that opportunity to really explore and support people in navigating that for themselves.
Yeah, so when we're thinking about this open, honest, and authentic prevention principle, we know that when we provide information in this way that's honest and transparent and coming from a human-centered place, that we can connect with people more easily. This matters because many of the topics that we want to talk about when doing prevention work, like Meg was saying, have been considered taboo or difficult to a lot of people when it comes to being able to have discussions about these things. So when we're open and honest and authentic, we can start to break down some of those barriers. And that in turn will help us reduce the stigma that's attached to these conversations. So the example on the screen here asks us to think about some considerations when responding to youth. These are things like, how does trauma affect young folks? What options are available to young folks? Are you a mandatory reporter? And if so, what are your responsibilities? And how do you openly, honestly, and authentically communicate these to youth? One thing that we often find, especially when we have youth who are accessing services, is that there can be an element of ageism or adultism that can be present with how we provide information or what we deem as appropriate to give to young folks. And when we are controlling that information and not answering questions, or we're not giving options and fully making sure that youth are able to understand what they're getting into, what they should expect, what they can access, how they can find support. All these things are going to impact the way that we do our prevention work and limit us. So this is a really great example that gives us a place to think about not only oppression when we're looking at, ageism and adultism, but to really think critically about how are we actively working against those ideas that maybe we have all the answers on behalf of people, even if we're not entirely sure exactly what they need, if we're not giving them the space to tell us.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. I think I've sat in on so many SANE trainings and so many advocacy trainings talking about medical advocacy. And so often those trainings will include information like a person can submit a safe exam anonymously, which is true unless you are under the age of 18. And I've never heard in any of those trainings folks make that distinction. And so understanding that statistically, almost half of people who experience sexual assault or sexual violence are under the age of 18. Why is that not informing how we do our work? And how is not being open, honest, transparent, authentic about what it might look like for people of different ages, potentially reinforcing harm and trauma that we are trying to mitigate? So really, those open, honest, and authentic, those transparent pieces are so critical, not just in promoting what is healthy, but also making sure that we're not reinforcing trauma. Another way I think this comes up a lot is around talking about consent. So often I have heard folks offer up kind of a rule for what consent looks like or needs to look like, which just is not particularly authentic, as opposed to thinking about how do we personally describe what consent is? What does consent look like to us? What does it feel like to us? What does it sound like to us? We can offer rules all day, and the fact is situations are going to arise where that feels inaccessible or complicated. How we talk about consent has changed so much in just the last few years, let alone how we talked about it 20 years ago and longer, if we talked about it at all. I've heard many folks refer to consent as permission. I've heard it described as someone saying no. I've heard debates about verbal versus nonverbal consent. We know that consent is confusing. We use consent in a lot of different ways. In law enforcement settings, we use consent to discuss whether or not a sex act was rape or assault or wanted. We talk about the law when it comes to who can legally give consent. What we often have a harder time talking about when it comes to consent is what consent looks like when you're promoting healthy sexuality. There are a lot of definitions out there. For a really long time, how we talked about consent was no means no. which is absolutely true. No does mean no. And where that got us is folks saying, well, they didn't say no, so it couldn't be sexual violence, which is not the goal of consent, right? That piece about fear-driven versus pleasure-focused. The official SATF definition is yes when no is a viable option. This is still kind of rooted in how we understand consent legally. The most common definition I used to use is a freely given enthusiastic yes, which is really fun because then you can ask folks in the room or in the space to say yes in an enthusiastic way and see what that feels like. That being said, this really doesn't take into account nonverbal consent situations. So thinking about what does it mean to talk about consent in open and authentic ways? What does it really mean? What does it sound like? What does it really mean to be freely given? How do we talk about how consent impacts violence or impacts healthy sexuality? How do we talk about it when these complicated questions and situations arise? These are questions that I got from young people when I was still teaching violence prevention in middle and high schools. And things like, what if both or all people were drunk? Is one of those places where legally we can default on a definition of, if someone is mentally incapacitated, they cannot legally consent to sexual activity. That being said, this is where I throw out a made up fact. So you can cite me on it, but I have no evidence to support it. But I genuinely believe that the vast majority of adults who are having sex, who also drink, at some point in their lives have had consensual sex after drinking. So what kind of skills are we building for people if all we're defaulting to is the law and we're not really diving into what does consent look, feel, or sound like? Folks often, going back to that definition of enthusiastic, folks so often are like, it has to be enthusiastic. And then, I start to talk to my friends about it and think about it. And there are times when people like your partners or your partner are like, do you want to have sex? And you're like, yeah, I can do that. Sure. That's not a lot of enthusiasm, but that is absolutely consent for me. And so what does it look like to really explore these pieces and not offer someone this, rule that they have to follow, which may or may not work? We've set up conversations about consent, especially focusing on that fear-driven piece of this is how you don't sexually assault someone, to be, well, one person asks for consent and one person gives consent. That's not how consent works. Similarly, we often have, when we focus so much on the law, we know that people under the age of 18 in the state of Oregon cannot legally consent to sexual activity. When I would bring that up in classes, students would say, okay, well, if we can't consent, why are we talking about this? Which is not the goal of learning about consent. The goal is that people are engaging in consensual sexual behavior, even if they're under the age of 18 and they're going to engage in sexual behavior. It still needs to be consensual. So how can we foster these conversations that are more authentic and more open and more honest, and not just tied to here's the hard, fast rule that we have to stick with?
That brings us to prevention principle number 3, which is this idea of positive reframing. How can we use health promotion to frame our SANE work? Well, when it comes to primary prevention, this includes promoting positive norms, behaviors, and actions. This means thinking about what we're saying, how we're saying it, and what we could say instead. When it comes to changing harmful norms, it's not enough to just say what is bad or what is wrong. What are the norms and behaviors that we want instead? And what behaviors and norms do we want to promote? For example, we're going to look at 2 different questions and think about who they focus on. So the first question is, why did they stay? So what happens when people ask this question? Oftentimes we find there's a sense of guilt that comes with this. There's shaming. There's this idea that someone has done something wrong when we're thinking about, well, why would they stay in a situation that wasn't good for them or where they weren't safe, right? That's the tone that we're setting when we ask, why did they stay? Looking at the second question, we can ask, why did they hurt them? So what happens when people ask this question? Well, what happens is that simply by changing the way that we are asking this question, we are shifting the focus of violence to the people who have actually perpetrated it. This means that we're changing who is responsible for violence rather than thinking about the person who was assaulted or the victim or the survivor. As the person responsible, we are putting the responsibility of harm and of violence on the person who caused it. This is part of promoting healthy norms. We need to reframe so that we can be sure that we are actually capturing the reality of what's happening and not skewing this to include victim blaming or shame or guilt or all those things that we know shut people down and oftentimes prevent people from accessing services or from seeking help in the first place. We also have to be cognizant of the ways that our biases are showing up and may impact how we talk to and about people. This can be difficult when we have things in our own lives that connect us as humans to the work that we do. And we're not saying that we need to take our humanity out of the work. In fact, we absolutely don't think that. But we do need to think about how we're letting our experiences paint our interactions. How can we use our connections to the work as a source of strength? Where can we highlight resilience, adaptability, and the skills that we've gained in the work that we do?
This piece of reframing how we talk about violence and abuse helps us move away from those pieces like that Nicole just named, like victim blaming, shame, all those pieces. But it also lets us focus on solutions, which is that key part of prevention, right? We're not just trying to build awareness. We're not just trying to reduce the risk of experiencing violence. We are trying to move the needle and focus on solutions. So positive framing really helps us to do that. Oftentimes we will talk about violence exclusively in these ways that focus on what the problem is and not on what solutions are. So often we will hear things or say things, I've said this, sexual violence is an epidemic in our community and must be stopped. That is absolutely true, but it doesn't really get us anywhere in terms of how do we stop it, right? What do we do about it? Where do we go from here? And this is one of those things that just kind of reinforces this idea that this is inevitable and it's overwhelming and it's daunting. So we need to shift and focus more on some of those solutions. So our statewide prevention and education committee many years ago did some intentional work to reframe how we're talking about sexual violence to really focus on health promotion. And one of the things they offered was instead of just saying sexual violence is an epidemic in our community and must be stopped, let's add in everyone has a role in promoting healthy sexuality, interactions, and relationships. This gives us a direction forward, right? This helps us understand that if we are promoting healthy sexuality, healthy interactions, healthy relationships, if we're modeling those skills, if we're talking about those pieces, if we're making space for healthy sexuality and health promotion in general in our work, we are going to be able to start addressing the epidemic that is sexual violence. Similarly, we just talked a lot about consent. So often we say things like, consent is about partners not having to do things that make them uncomfortable. Again, this is absolutely true. This doesn't get me any closer to understanding how I practice good consent. And so we offered in the Prevention Education Committee, consent lets people express what they want, like, need, and what gives them pleasure in a relationship, right? And this might be any kind of relationship. We're not limiting it to monogamous, heteronormative relationships. And this isn't just about sex, right? This could be about, love languages, communication styles, food. It can be about so many things, right? Consent isn't just about sex. So how do we support folks in expressing what they want, like, need, and what gives them pleasure? And I think that's a huge piece already of our SANE work. We just haven't maybe framed it in that way. And how do we expand on that for folks so they can extrapolate and add those pieces to their daily lives? Additionally, things like no one deserves to be assaulted, again, absolutely true, but feels very different than everyone deserves to have safe consensual sex. And what we know about violence is that it often gets worse over time. The number of times I have said this one, which is again, absolutely true. But if we add in or shift to focus on when relationships are healthy, this says both people, maybe we want to say all people to be more inclusive, all people feel safe, all people feel supported, and all people feel respected. And then we can spend some time talking about what does it look like for each of us to feel safe, to feel supported, to feel respected. There's so much more opportunity that we have when we are incorporating what is healthy into our practice, whether that is SANE work, advocacy work, other intervention or response work. These are key pieces to making our work more impactful and helping us move towards prevention.
Yes, so now that we've talked about these principles, let's think about what we can do to incorporate these prevention principles into your SANE work. So one great place to start is thinking about your materials. Do they use this positive framing? Are they comprehensive? Do you have materials that meet the needs of all members of your communities? These are great places to start when we're thinking about what we can offer folks who are seeking services. Let's also think about the conversations that we're having. Are we using language that promotes healthy norms? Are we providing resources and information to everyone who enters? And this can include participants' kids, family members, other people who are there with them to help prevent future instances of violence and abuse. Do you have materials that provide comprehensive information? How can you rephrase some of the language to promote healthy norms? And are there places that you need to learn more in order to provide the most accurate information possible to your participants?
I love this so much. So often when I was an advocate, we would have parents come in to access services and they'd bring their kids. And our solution was, okay, let's put the kids in this room and they can play with toys while we're working with the parent. And there's so much opportunity, right, to make sure that even if we're not directly serving someone, how are we increasing access to their kids, their family members, those other folks in their lives, and them information on healthy sexuality, especially if, you know, their observations or their understanding of relationships, sex, sexuality has exclusively been violent. How can we counteract that a little bit and help folks navigate or know where to start accessing information? Similarly, are you modeling positive behaviors? Are you modeling healthy behaviors? Are you modeling healthy relationships? Are you modeling anti-oppression, inclusion, all those pieces that we've talked about? Are you also maybe acknowledging, modeling those pieces of when we say or do something that may be harmful and learning from that and growing from that? In prevention work, one of the things that we are asking folks to do is to learn from harm that they've caused and actively work not to cause that harm again. We think about that with bystander intervention. We think about that with other examples of prevention. And if we're not able to model that for folks, how do we ever expect other folks to be able to cultivate those skills? Additionally, I often think about this in terms of boundaries. How are we modeling healthy boundary setting? So often I hear from people who are working in intervention or response work, whether that is advocacy or SANE work or something else, that they are available 24/7, which is part of the SANE model oftentimes. But they're available constantly. They'll go above and beyond. They'll do everything for survivors. And the problem with that is that doesn't model good boundaries for folks. And the impact of having someone model healthy boundaries can be so profound and is so deeply tied to prevention. So how are we modeling those positive behaviors? A lot of times I'm in training spaces, for example, and I'll say, are we ready to move on? And folks will often just stare at me blankly. Does silence and blank stares mean yes? Is that modeling good consent? How are these pieces being modeled and incorporated into all the things that we do? Similarly, what is your presence like? How are you connecting with people outside of SANE work, outside of advocacy work? Are you present in the communities that you work with and within, in your community's events? Are you modeling any bystander intervention? Are you looking at those places where maybe you have some power that others maybe don't have, and how can you adjust those? I want to also just name that this work takes practice. It's not something that we're going to be, amazing at overnight. I often think about my skills with bystander intervention. I didn't become even like remotely okay at bystander intervention until I taught it multiple times every day for 6 months. It takes practice, and we have to intentionally look for those opportunities to practice, whether it is those addressing root causes skills or those health promotion skills.
Absolutely. And really, this is a great chance for us to think more about how prevention is really accomplishable when we are thinking about prevention through teamwork. Sexual violence is preventable, and everybody has a role and a responsibility in preventing it. Something that we like to talk about a lot at the task force is the overlap of multiple disciplines and multiple different areas of prevention that often intersect in ways that folks maybe aren't aware of or focusing on or thinking of when we're trying to think about what our role is in prevention. So we talk a lot about how, maybe traditionally folks who are doing sexuality education work or, other primary prevention work that is at the forefront of what we think of as primary prevention. Oftentimes there are folks who don't see themselves in that role or see themselves through the perspective of being a preventionist. And we like to broaden that idea and to ask folks to think more comprehensively about what it really takes to create healthy and safe communities and to provide access to services and to be sure that folks have their needs met, right? This means broadening it out to think about things like mental health and medical access via insurance, right? Do folks have access to substance abuse treatment if they need it, or resources on, healthy use? Are we ensuring that folks have access to food and that they have, a roof over their head? There's so much more to prevention than just being what might historically have been considered a preventionist. And you can't see it, but I'm air quoting. There's so much more than just, those things that we think about through that lens. There's this whole broad network of ways that we can think about what allows us to create healthy and safe communities. And when we're looking at it through that lens, when we're thinking more broadly about what it really means to make sure that folks are having what they need, it's much easier for us to understand that we all truly play a role in this and that we all really absolutely have the ability to prevent violence and abuse when we're thinking more creatively and when we're thinking more comprehensively about what is necessary for folks to thrive.
So as you go back out of this session into your work, think about some of these key themes from this presentation. Violence is preventable. How does this influence your approach to your work, to programming, to how you do your work, how you organize your work, how you work with survivors and other folks? Health promotion is violence prevention. What does this mean for you, for your work, and how you can incorporate this into the work that you do? What does health promotion look like generally, but also for you? And why might this be an effective way of preventing violence? And then oppression is the root cause of violence. How does this inform the ways that we all talk about violence and approach its prevention? In this presentation, we have really focused on how prevention can be incorporated into traditional models of SANE work, advocacy work, other examples of work. And we also recognize that a lot of SANEs, in particular in communities throughout the country, but especially here in Oregon, get asked a lot to do prevention education and other more traditional prevention programming with partners like schools and community programs. If you would like to learn more about a massive infrastructure that has been built here in the state to really support prevention education and some of that more traditional prevention work. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us at the Sexual Assault Task Force. We are happy to connect you to those resources and that infrastructure.
And that brings us to the end of our time together, folks. Thank you so much for tuning into this webinar and for the opportunity to be a part of the Sexual Assault Response Summit. We are so grateful that you've taken the time to be here and to listen and to hopefully learn something today. And if anything is coming up for you at all, you have questions, feedback, you want to partner, you have all these big ideas in your head about how we can make prevention even better in the work that you do as SANEs, please reach out to us. Our names, our email addresses, and the phone number that you can reach us at are on the screen here. Thank you so much.